to take a step back and talk about a subject that economists like to discuss. If you ask the question of what is macroeconomics, the answer has to do with the big aggregates in the economy. So income, growth, employment, inflation, exchange rate. The one that is the most interesting and perhaps relevant for the Middle East and many other countries in the world is growth. So this talk will have a short overview of things that impact growth in the Middle East. Here is the GDP per capita in the region, and what you can see is that there is a wide diversity of levels of well-being as measured by GDP per capita in the Middle East, from high-income countries richer than the Western Europe to countries that have as much income as those in sub-Saharan Africa. If you ask the question of why do we have such a difference in standard of living across countries, economists would answer the question by saying there are mainly three factors: labor, people, educated people; capital, that is funding and things that go into making things and services; and then something that is called productivity. And we'll talk about that in a second. Productivity, innovations that make the economy more productive. Of course, especially in the Middle East, oil helps a lot, right, to differentiate countries that have higher income than others that do not. If you look around the world and look at countries that have grown over time and ask the question, why have they grown? The answer empirically has to do not with the amount of labor, not majoritarily with the amount of labor that they have or capital, but with everything else, which economists call productivity. 60% of the data, or when you look at what is behind growth, 60% of what's behind of growth over time is what we call productivity. If instead of looking at growth over time for a specific country, you look at all countries at once today, and you ask the question, what's behind the fact that some countries have a lot of income and some others are really poor? 66% of what's behind higher income versus lower income countries is, again, productivity. So economists have been looking at what is productivity, what's mostly behind growth, for a long time. Intuitively, the easiest way to explain productivity is to say it is the ability to make deals, what you do on a daily basis. So let's take a look at what that is for economies, for a macroeconomist. How do your innovations become goods and services that increase the standard of living of a population? So about 20 years ago, a very well-known economist came up with an explanation that in my mind makes the argument really well. He said, you can describe governments as acting as if they had a helping hand towards the economy, versus other governments that act as if they had a grabbing hand towards business. So the helping hand government lets competition work so that the resources of the economy go to the best possible alternatives. A helping hand type of government makes sure that laws and regulations protect property rights, both physical property and, importantly, nowadays, intellectual property. And a helping hand type of a government makes sure that the rule of law is respected, that people have access to the law, that men and women are treated equally, that you can go and have recourse when one of your contracts doesn't work very well. Remember, what's behind all of this is the ability to do business, to make deals. A grabbing hand type of a government takes property, owns what the most important resources in the economy, allows corruption to take place, and many actors in the economy to grab from the private sector, impose many bureaucratic regulations so that on the one hand, there are opportunities for those who live from corruption to actually get their price, and on the other hand, impede the working of business. Finally, outright prohibitions. Women cannot do this, for example, is one of the aspects of the grabbing hand type of government. So that's at a very high level. Now, what happens is that people around the world vote with their money, and they decide where to invest. So a very revealing aspect of how is the MENA region perceived is what is happening to foreign direct investment. Between the year 2010 and 2015, Africa had experienced, sub-Saharan Africa, experienced an increase in foreign direct investment of 76%. Latin America, I believe 11%. The Middle East had a decline in foreign direct investment of 53%. Foreign capital is saying, I don't want to go there. So let's turn it around and ask ourselves the question of how do we improve productivity? What does it take? And importantly, how do we measure? So economists have been working at this for a very long time. I'm going to start with an index collected by by the World Economic Forum that basically asks business people, and these are business people in oil exporting countries. And I must say that looking at the data, oil exporting countries tend to have better government functioning than oil importing countries. So if we just look at the better half, the oil exporting countries, and ask business people, what makes your work harder to do business? They would say access to finance, funding. Second, restrictive labor regulations. So here we have capital and labor. Third, inefficient government bureaucracy. So they are telling us what makes business difficult in the Middle East. Here is another collection. I'm just going to go through a few slides of data to show you. Here is Transparency International's Index of Corruption as a heat map in the world. You can see that the Middle East region is pretty red. Not good news. Okay, this is corruption with data as of 2017. Sorry that the titles are not there, but trust me, Corruption 2017 Index of the World. Okay, I'm going to skip that. This is another trustworthy institution, the World Bank, which collects and has been collecting for decades now something called an index, a very complete index that has 190 countries. And the index is called, the survey is called Ease of Doing Business. And what they do is they collect data on labor regulations, government bureaucracy, access to electricity, access to building infrastructure, all sorts of things that business people, such as yourself, would need to would need to have access to be able to start a business. And then they rank countries in order of the ease of doing business. So the regional average for the AMENA region is 112 in terms of rank. That means that there are 111 countries on average that do business, where business is easier to undertake. Saudi Arabia, just to take an example there, is, can you guys see it? 92. Saudi Arabia ranks 92. That means there are 91 countries where it is easier to do business out of almost 200 than in Saudi Arabia. Okay, the ease of doing business work is very granular, and it has a super important indicator called starting a business. This ranking has the countries in the MENA region with the number of procedures needed to start a business. The average for the region is 7 procedures. Iran and Saudi Arabia have 10, just licenses, permits, and things you need to do to start a business. And in terms of days, on average, in the region, it takes 21 days to get all of your permits to start a business. In Kuwait, it takes 35 days. Then we can compute how much does it take in terms of income per capita. I'm going to skip that and go to another data piece that tells us a little bit about how easy or difficult it is to do business, and it is trading across borders. So the World Bank also ranks country by the hours spent complying with regulations to import something. So Saudi Arabia, just to pick a country, it takes 228 hours to comply with all of those regulations. In this indicator, the Middle East is the worst compared with all other emerging markets. We can also have the cost in terms of dollars as opposed to days. So there are many impediments and signals that if you qualify government's actions as a helping hand to governments versus a grabbing hand from governments, the Middle East region does not fare very well. There is a lot of work to do, a lot of obstacles for ideas and innovations that you have to become services and goods that might improve the standard of living of the countries in the region. So there are lots of opportunities to innovate, and the time is right now, as oil prices are not doing as poorly as they were in 2015. I know that I'm standing between you and your coffee, so thank you very much.